Wakefield on this timely webinar as we begin the transition from crisis response to careful recovery. This webinar is the first of a series of virtual gatherings hosted by the City of Markham in partnership with the private sector, aimed at economic recovery. The series is meant to support our business and investor community, build economic resilience, and chart a new path to sustainable growth. I'd like to thank our Markham City Councillors for being here today, starting with Deputy Mayor Don Hamilton, Ward 7 Councillor Khalid Usman, who's also Vice Chair of our Economic Development and Culture Committee, and Ward 6 Councillor Amanda Colucci. It may have missed some councillors, and we'll look for you. There's a lot of people attending today. We're expecting close to 300. So we will find you, and I'm hoping that you'll stay with us through the entire session. I'd also like to welcome Minister of Parliament Majid Jowri, as well as Minister of Provincial Parliament Daisy Way for joining us today. And in Markham, although the delivery of our services has been modified, our elected officials and city staff are hard at work and continue to provide essential services, including accepting building and planning applications online through our ePlan tool. And I see that our Commissioner of Development Services, Arvind Prasad, has also joined us, so welcome, Arvind. Markham is a rapidly urbanizing city on the northern border of Toronto. Our city is known for its strong tech cluster, our innovative businesses, our business-friendly approach, and our diverse and entrepreneurial population. The story of Markham's growth is closely linked to the success of our business community. Global brands like IBM, AMD, Qualcomm, and GM put Markham on the map, and the thousands of small to medium-sized businesses in tech, financial services, engineering, and creative industries have kept us resilient. And like all beloved cities and towns, our Main Street businesses are the heart of our neighborhoods and the places we gather for cultural events and celebrations. No matter the size of the business, all have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and all will need a strong recovery plan to emerge safely from under the long shadow of the virus. Today's Globe and Mail reported on the results of a poll conducted by Modus Research. The survey of 1,000 managers taken between April 20th and April 30th showed that 21% of the companies polled said they won't survive 3 months under the current restrictions. They don't have sufficient revenues, cash reserves, or available credit to remain viable, even with government assistance programs. 5% said they had already shut down. If the COVID restrictions were pushed out to 6 months, nearly half say they wouldn't make it. The good news is Ontario and other provinces across Canada are starting to phase in reopening of businesses. It's important to note that all governments are stressing the importance of following public health and safety regulations and guidelines to avoid a resurgence of the virus and prolonged economic slowdown. Today, we will hear from Samantha Sanella, Managing Director, Strategic Consulting at Cushman Wakefield. Samantha specializes in design management, workplace strategy, occupancy planning, project management, and future-focused building solutions. Through the current global health crisis, Samantha and her team are working directly with clients of all sizes to realign their real estate solutions to mitigate workplace risks to employees and help organizations reimagine their operational approaches to embrace blended home office work. Drawing from Cushman and Wakefield experience in helping companies in China and Europe develop return to work strategies, Samantha will walk us through concise, actionable steps that organizations can take now to begin the long-term transformative journey. Before we begin, I'd like to share some housekeeping items as follows. Note that everyone is placed on mute. You can send your questions using chat anytime during the presentation. Questions will be reserved for the end of the presentation. The meeting is being recorded and the presentation will be available on demand. Please bear with us in case there are any technical challenges. The internet bandwidth and connection you are using will determine the quality of video and audio you are receiving. And you may want to preserve bandwidth by turning off the video during Samantha's presentation. And so with that, I will pass the floor to Samantha. Welcome, Samantha.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'd like to say that we have a long working relationship with the City of Markham, and we appreciate you inviting us to share our experiences with you. And hopefully you guys will find some good tidbits and we'll find some information very useful from our lessons learned. We do have a number of guides that we've published thus far, some how-to guides, some working from home guides, and also something we're calling the Safe Six. And we have a number of articles that have come out as well. And I'll make sure that, Christina, you guys have those so you can disseminate those to the group.
Great, thanks, Sam. I'd like also to take a second to acknowledge the chair of our Economic Development and Culture Committee, Councillor Alan Ho. Welcome, Councillor Ho.
Okay, great. Is it okay if I start sharing my screen now?
Go ahead.
Well, let's hope it works. Nothing like working at home with all these technology issues. I would like to say, let's see if I can get this going. For my own housekeeping, I do have two small dogs, very fluffy kind who like to bark a lot. So just in case they bark, that's what's going on. And I know we're all having these our own work from home issues as well. I have a plumber here today banging on the pipe. So occasionally we might hear that too. Okay, great. Well, we'll get started. So this is about returning to the workplace, and it's what I'm calling the next normal, because a lot of people are asking me, well, won't it go back to normal? And I don't think it will. I do think no matter what happens, whether we find a vaccine or not, the idea that we can catch things in the workplace is sort of stuck in our collective conscious now. So I do think that we will be looking at some of these strategies on an ongoing basis, and hopefully they'll provide some innovative solutions in the future. So the big question that we're getting asked is, how do we build trust and mitigate risk in the new normal workplace? And mitigating risk is the key term here, because there is no such thing as a 100% virus-free workplace. It just, no matter what you do, how many precautions you can take, it's just not possible, considering that the virus is asymptomatic and invisible. So all we can do is put together a number of strategies that really help mitigate the risk. And to be perfectly honest, we don't know to what degree all of these strategies help. However, we do know some things do help, and we'll cover that in the presentation. So this is a picture of my brain right now. That's what I like to call it, because all these words are floating in my head all day long as we've had to pivot to look at the workplace under the lens of COVID-19. So it does mean, you know, a lot of these things: less shared spaces, no access to telephone rooms, potential mask in the workplace, clean desk policies, hand sanitizer, antibacterial wipes, etc. All those things we wish we would have bought stock in before this happened. But these things are the important things for us to figure out how the protocols are going to work in the office space to make us functional and productive. One of the biggest questions we get asked every day is, what about elevators? Now, I know that this is less of a problem in Markham because we're not talking about 50-story buildings, but even so, you know, access to the elevators at times, you know, lunch times and things like that can be problematic. So a lot of this is based on protocols, and I will go through that during the presentation. So Cushman Wakefield has developed a sort of 6-stage approach to the problem. Uh-oh, I hear my Yorkie, he's starting to bark. Cushman Wakefield has developed a 6-stage approach to the problem, and we're calling this the Safe Six Essentials, and I will provide this guideline to you guys so you can download it. And this is a snapshot for tackling your own approach back to the workplace, and I'll be going through these steps. So the first step is to prepare the building. The second step is to prepare the workforce, because we have to understand who and when can and how they come back. The third is about controlling access to your spaces. You know, how does a UPS man deliver a package? And then creating a social distancing plan within the workplace continues to be a very important subject. Reducing touch points and increasing cleaning. And for OCD people like me, I love this subject. And then communicating for confidence, because no matter what you do, you have to make sure that you're providing this sort of transparent communication strategy to your employees so that they know about their own risks of taking to come into the workplace. Okay, so let's talk about preparing the building first. In preparing the building, the key things is communicate with the landlord. And right now, the landlords are sort of coalescing around this within the greater GTA and trying to understand what building owners are going to provide and what their protocols are going to be for maintaining the common areas in the building. And right now, we're still waiting to hear from a lot of landlords as to what they're doing. We have a number of calls set up with the REITs and developers to understand what their obligations are to the tenants in the building and exactly how they're going to go above and beyond to sort of protect the health of the tenant. As you can see, she decided to sit in my lap. So anyway, this might work out okay. I call her my colleague now. The second hot button topic is all about HVAC. So right now it's not known if the virus is spread through the HVAC system. We don't think it is. So this is something that we're looking at with landlords. And we did have a paper just released today that talks about some of the protocols that we can use in HVAC systems to make it safer. Product cleaning is also very important. I heard from a client yesterday that they had just resorted to trying to clean everything with bleach. They never closed down because they're essential workers, but yet bleach will ruin a lot of products and ruin a lot of finishes on your furniture. So you paid a lot of money for it. So it's best to go to the furniture manufacturers to look for some of these solutions. And then, ensuring compliance. We're all still waiting on provincial guidelines to come out. And so how the provincial guidelines affect how we return to work, we're not sure yet. We do recommend you start your plan already though, and then you can tweak it based on those guidelines. And then, changing cleaning scopes or additional services with vendors, inspecting everything. Once they give us the go-ahead, someone still has to send a team into the building to make sure that building is ready before you bring people back to work. Now, the next thing is preparing the workforce. And this is probably the hardest part of the whole return to work because everybody has a lot of anxiety. I call it the sort of collective consciousness of anxiety we are feeling right now. Every time you flip on the news, you hear a story. Today it was a daycare. And so we're having we've seen the virus in daycare in Toronto and Montreal. And of course that brings a lot of anxiety because you don't want to, risk children's. We're usually able to risk our own lives, but we don't want to risk the life of our children. So anyway, just mitigating that kind of anxiety is important for people to do. And then, understanding what might be the benefit of returning to work or what might be the benefit of continued work from home. There's a lot of folks who, even though they, maybe they consider themselves high risk, who will want to continue to work from home, or they psychologically are just not ready to come back, or they may have things like public transportation they're not ready to tackle yet in their own lives. And so they can't return. So I think it's up to the employer to really make sure they understand the mindset of each person. It is a very individual solution. And it's one reason we're recommending that HR is a very integrated part of this process of the return to work. We also have to, part of this transparent communication is to make sure that our employees understand the detailed plan of how this is going to work, if it's going to be phased, if there's going to be different protocols within the office environment that they themselves will have to adhere to. What are the repercussions of not adhering to those? How you socially distance in the workplace, and then maybe there's some self-cleaning and things you have to do. So it really is a wholesale mind shift on your behavior, and we just have to make sure that we're putting the right things in place so that people know what to expect, because if they don't know what to expect, they're going to have a lot more anxiety about returning to work. So some of the things that we're chatting about are, what does the overall plan look like, and how do we start? So in general terms, the overall plan for a return to work, and this of course depends on the size of your company, your organization, I say is 4 to 6 weeks. Sorry, that's, the Otis is barking at the postman. So 4 to 6 weeks. And we're still waiting on these gates, as I call them, the national and provincial guidelines. Otis, come here. Sorry, the national and provincial guidelines. And if any cities are going to come out with their recommendations as well, like if the city recommends that you wear a mask in public transportation, things like that, we have to adhere to. And then, of course, as I just said, what the building and the landlords are going to put into place for us regarding elevators and common spaces and washrooms, and then what your own organization puts into place on top of that, which could include increased cleaning protocols or behavioral protocols, et cetera. And in doing that, we want to make sure we're always looking at the hot spots. What carry the greatest risk, and how do we mitigate those things? Now, when it comes to people working from home, as I said, who comes back to work? This really does depend on how you get to work and what your own personal situation is. And as I've just said about the daycares, what your own family obligations are, because it's hard to imagine if schools don't reopen and we don't have summer camps this summer, a lot of people are going to be staying at home day drinking to manage their children. But anyway, so that's just a joke. I start my drinking at 5 o'clock. And so we really have to look at that on the case-by-case basis and make sure that we have a solid work from home strategy in place. And I think a lot of HR groups in the organizations I've been speaking to are working on that and are providing sort of a lot of leeway in how people can continue to work from home and how we can support that work. Part of putting together this sort of preparing the workforce is what I call the organizational pulse check. And this includes, you know, how productive are you working from home now? Who do you collaborate with? If you were to continue to work from home, you know, how long can you see yourself doing that? Because as we know, it's one thing to work from home for 2 months or 3 months, and it's sort of novel because you're caught up on your laundry between conference calls and things like that. But for a whole year, it might start to wear on people. So this is something I recommend that you consider doing on a staggered timeline. So maybe it's an organizational pulse check now, and you do it again in 3 months, and then again in 3 months to see where your people are and how they're feeling about this. And as well, because we do believe that re-entry into the workplace is going to be phased, it's important that, let's say, if only 25% of the workforce come back at first, and, you know, you still have 75% at home, and then, you know, et cetera. So this sort of thing, I think, engages the employee and also gives us good insight into to where the organization's at. And if any of you are interested, Cushman offers something like this, so we're more than happy to chat with you about it. Now, this is a report that came out from Harvard a couple of weeks ago. They indicate that as many as 30% of people will continue to work from home after, even after we're given the all clear to go back to work. And Christina, I know when we were discussing this earlier this week, you asked me what was the percentage of people working at home before. In actuality, it was 4% only. So we consider only 4% of the population pre-COVID to be mobile. And of course now, it's the biggest at-home work project, pilot project in the world. But I do expect about 30% will continue. And part of this is because a lot of people really are high risk, you know, and high risk can mean having asthma or having high blood pressure. So relatively benign problems in the normal sense of life, but given the lens of COVID on it, you know, makes us doubt wanting to come back. Now, the controlling the access to the building is really important, and this is something that a lot of people haven't thought about either. Where do you deliver? Who delivers? How do you get packages in? And some of this is landlord dependent. But even if the landlords are letting delivery people up the elevators or into the building, you may want to consider what you're doing with them when they arrive at your space. So, you know, perhaps they're limited to a certain part of the lobby. Perhaps guests who come in are limited to a certain meeting room. From our own perspective, Cushman has come out and said we're going to be no guests during the first phase of return to work. So we won't be allowed to have guests in the office, even for meetings. Meetings will have to continue to be Zoom meetings with clients or webinars, whatever. So there are some concerns over temperature checks at buildings, and this is something that Asia is doing and has been doing for their return to work, and we've learned from them. And if you decide to do temperature checks, it's just a reminder to make them non-discriminatory. So if you're going to check temperatures every day of all people, just make sure that you're catching all people every day. And as we do know from the news, the medical professionals are saying temperatures are only elevated for about 30% of the population who do have symptoms. So you're still missing, you know, a huge swath of the population who still might have the virus. And I think this has been one of the concerns on construction sites where they've already started to check temperatures, that, you know, the virus is still spreading, even though they're taking these precautions. As well, what kinds of hand sanitizer, wipes, and personal protective equipment are going to be available to people? And are you, as an organizer of a business, providing that? Or are you allowing people to bring their own, et cetera? So we don't have an answer to this. This is something that an organization has to agree upon across the board. From our own organization, Cushman is providing masks for our employees. It's not clear if they're mandated we wear them at this moment because we're unrolling our own plan right now. But I have spoken to some clients who said they are going to provide them globally for all of their folks, and they are required in the office as long as they're there. Other ones have said, oh, they're only required if you get up and you're circulating around. So this is really dependent on your workspace layout and how much distancing you have in the workspace. But this is something that's on top of everybody's mind. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. And as we know, the vaccines take a while to develop and put on the market. So, you know, there is some research saying that this could be in place as long as 1 to 2 years. We just don't know yet. And then there's little detailed things like disabling touch screens, you know, how do you manage people touching your door handles and things like that. So these are all important things to think about when you think about other people accessing your building or accessing your space. Now, creating social distancing in the workplace, of course, is really important. And it's funny that social distancing wasn't in anyone's vocabulary until, you know, January, but social distancing has become very important to all of us. Here's why. So I like to throw this factoid in. In open office spaces, you already had somewhere between a 12 and 18% chance, greater than in closed offices, of a virus spread. And this study was done long before COVID, and it was done in relation to the flu spread in office spaces. So we know that in open offices, you tend to spread germs more. So of course that gives us a big spotlight on this particular situation. And then other things that we don't normally think about, and this stat came from our Asian study, a coffee pot has 35% more germs than the office toilet seat. And I know all of you are laughing because it's freaking everybody out. That common coffee pot, we have to think about how that's going to be managed throughout the day, whether you're going to cease to offer coffee or somebody's going to walk around and pour the coffee or whatever. But these are just little things I think you have to think about. And social distancing is important for this reason. When you sneeze or you cough, or you're a speaker that I like to call who likes to enunciate and is a little bit of a spitter, for lack of better terminology, those particles project out, and they do tend to drop, as this graphic shows, in the first 6 feet. So the graphic is split into 4 quadrants, each one about 6 feet. However, beyond that 6 feet, things do spray. And we know this because we're all watching the news and understanding, you know, what's going on from our medical professionals. But social distancing is important because those droplets have the most propensity to drop within the 6 feet. However, it doesn't mean you won't get droplets on you in the 8 to 10 foot level, or even particles spraying out beyond that. So we just have to make sure that the 6 feet is our #1 line of risk defense. So we have to make sure we're staying within that 6 foot distance. And that's why this is important. And it really is, combined with a few other things, probably one of the best risk mitigation factors, as I just said. So in a workplace, the things we're recommending for distancing, you know, a lot of people now are in smaller cubicles. In the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of densification in the office space, even taking away cubicles and going to benching or shared spaces, hoteling, things like that. Well, there's going to be a lot of reluctance to share space, and I don't blame you. I don't think I'd want to share space right now either. So I do recommend that people are individually assigned spaces. And they're in those spaces, we have to make sure that we have a 6 foot bubble around the person. And again, this is not a foolproof thing. This is just line 1 in the risk mitigation. So this includes in your seated position, and also in the circulation around you. Which brings us to meeting rooms. So meeting rooms are sort of a, you know, potential hot spot because you sneeze, cough, talk, or whatever, the germs are sprayed and they're trapped in a room. So for small meeting rooms, we are recommending that you probably use them as a single-use room. And for larger ones, that you take away chairs and or marked chairs that are not for use, so that you can maintain that social distancing in the meeting rooms, at least for the short term. And then the third thing really is that one-way circulation. So a lot of this is going to be very difficult to control. Can't imagine telling my own sons how they might circulate one way. They wouldn't listen at all. So I think it's important that people use your common sense. You know, if you see people, you know, collecting in circulation pass or loitering or whatever, that there has to be someone sort of poking and prodding people. Hey, you know, let's be respectful, everybody, and let's make sure that we're not, you know, in other people's circulation space on a continued basis. And this is one of the reasons we're seeing people say, okay, well, if this is the case, let's wear masks when we're circulating around the office. And then the last thing is even washrooms and kitchens. We have to look at how you will socially distance in those spaces. And washrooms, one of the hardest things to manage. And again, you know, somebody may wish to hire a washroom attendant. Somebody may wish to have a knock procedure, you know, before you go in, or you might wish to change things to touchless. Like there's a lot of things in managing the washroom environment that you have to think about, especially if you're sharing that washroom outside of your own organization, which is going to make it even more complex. So in this sort of protocols and practices of preparing the workforce, as I just said, I think that shared spaces, you know, are sort of going to be faux pas right now. So I do recommend the individual spaces. We do recommend phasing and bringing people back. Sometimes we're talking about panels between the desks. Now, the jury's sort of out on whether those really are more just for psychological comfort or if they actually do protect you. So a lot of people have asked me about adding the plexiglass panels or adding glass panels between the desks. Whatever you do add, and if you do add them between the desks, make sure they're easy to clean. So right now, you know, we see a lot of fabric panels between desks. Those aren't the easiest things to clean if you're sneezing or coughing on them. And so if you're going to add something, I would say check with your furniture manufacturer and make sure that it is cleanable. The stringent cleaning protocols, of course, are still important. Reducing the capacity of spaces, I just said. And you know, those telephone rooms, which we all love, because we're all in open office now, and we love going in our telephone rooms to, you know, call our kids and tell them to start their homework or to call your doctor or whatever. Those things really are the petri dishes of the office space. So we can't continue to use those like we've used them previously. And those you might want to consider as single-use office for people who are on the phone all the time, at least for the near term. And here's an example of a plan that we've put together so you can see the kind of maps that we're doing, which show which workstations can be used. They have a light blue circle around them, how the traffic patterns might work, which are the orange arrows, and how this affects capacity for your floors. So for instance, this is our floor at 161 Bay Street for our Cushman downtown office. And pre-COVID, the capacity was 125, post-COVID, 93. And this actually is pretty good. And we wouldn't have all 93 people come in immediately. Again, we'd phase them in to make sure we can manage our common spaces. But then sort of the ultimate goal is to have people return to work and to manage this kind of capacity in the workspace. Now, reducing touch points. So the most risk in the office is carried, besides the kitchen coffee pot, your own personal risk, your chair and your phone. So thank goodness landline phones are sort of going away and we're all using our own personal cell phones, which you can wipe and disinfect, things like that. But if you do have a landline phone, you might want to consider switching to your, you know, headset and using voice over internet and getting rid of the phone systems now. But the one that concerns me a lot are chairs, because chairs can carry a lot of bacteria, especially if you're taking public transportation, you're sitting on a seat there, you come in, you sit on your own seat. Studies have shown this virus stays on cloth chairs as long as 3 days. So I think that we have to be extra diligent in figuring out how we're going to clean the chairs, how we might disinfect them, and also how this might change chair design in the future. So in the future, we might see more antimicrobial fabrics, or we might see things that are wipeable and easier to clean than fabric chairs. Even the mesh chairs with all the little holes could be something that holds bacteria and germs in the future. So just keep that in mind. So new protocols and practices for reducing touch points, disinfectants near the desk. And I think everybody should have and I know they're hard to get right now, the Lysol wipes to put on everybody's desk. And I know Cushman is our organization is helping people source those. In case you can't find them, you can always touch base with me and I can put you in touch with the right people to source some of these things. We're not sure what to do about food and beverages. Are we actually going to allow people to eat at their desk, or are they only allowed to eat in certain rooms and shifts or things like that? But even the shared, you know, everybody went to ceramic mugs to save the environment, but we might want to consider going back to disposable cups for the short term. Sanitizing all the spaces, limiting the in-person meetings. One thing that I would recommend for people to start to look at to put in their capital budgets for next year are the low touch, no touch switches, doors, drawers, etc. Because I think going forward, people are just going to be reluctant to, you know, have their hands on those things. And so providing the touchless, invest in touchless technology, I'm telling you, we'll make a lot of money if we do that. And then the clean desk policy. So I'm probably the worst offender of this, having lots of tchotchkes on my desk and lots of, you know, things that I love to look at every day. But that makes it very difficult for cleaning staff to do their job. So I think instituting a clean desk policy is really important. And maybe that's just taking all your stuff and having a box at your desk that you put it in, and then you take it out when you need it and you put it back. But that allows at least you know, the professionals to clean the desk every day. So here's another map on this is a map that shows the distancing plus the protocols put together, because it's really not just either or, it is a marriage of both of those things. In all cases, you can't distance at 6 feet. It just is impossible in some places. So we have to make sure that we are producing solutions that really do marry both those protocols and the distancing to work together for organizations. And I do tell organizations to just do as much as you can afford, but ultimately it's up to that person, your employee, to decide if they're gonna take the risk and come back. And then in doing these things, it's best to make them visible and transparent so people do know and understand what you're doing and how it's gonna work together for everybody. The last thing is really communicating for confidence, which was a good segue from the last point, in that really you have to align your leadership between HR, IT, risk, communications, and everybody to do these plans together and make sure that you're getting input in from staff, what they expect, and that you're giving that back to them in a transparent manner. And I think that does help set expectations and make people feel psychologically better. They understand, you know, there are increased cleaning protocols, and we're phasing for a reason, and we're doing all these things that will help alleviate anxiety. And also, you know, helping them understand, what are we doing about visitors and travel and this and that, and, you know, what happens if my kids are at home. And so I think that it's just up to the organizations at large to make sure they're doing everything they can do and communicating those things to the employees before you return to the office, not after, but before. And it actually helps to do it weeks in advance to get people used to the idea. Because some people don't like change. This has been very hard on a lot of people. And you have to look at the whole spectrum of psychology here. We have people in our own organization are like, I'm ready to go back. I'm ready to have face-to-face meetings, and et cetera. And then you have other ones on the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm never going back. I'm scared I'm going to get it, et cetera. And you have to respect sort of both spectrums here and make sure you're communicating to that wide range of people. And so this is just a list, and Chris, I can share this with you guys about just some of the detailed protocol things that our groups are doing for other organizations to make sure that we are tackling all these little things. I mean, even thinking about copy rooms and copy machines and how they're used is really important. So it's really like walking people through a day in the life of how you go through this office environment. Ultimately, something I would suggest to people, and what we are suggesting to other people and doing for clients, is putting together a playbook so that when you are communicating with groups, you're saying, okay, we've thought about all these things, we've collected all this information. Here is the playbook in which we're all going to agree by and operate from in the future. And this is going to be our guide for the next 6 months, and we're going to evaluate it in 6 months' time or 3 months' time or whatever. But this really gives you a deliverable to hand to your organization and will make your life a lot easier. And I just want to, this is sort of the afterthought, but I call it the reimagination about what's next. And that is, I see every crisis as an opportunity. So what are we going to learn from this? As I'm an architect and designer going forward, how can we make buildings better? Hopefully we'll prioritize health of the person and using the building and operating the building and maintaining the building. We will prioritize that in the future of design so that it does help a person mitigate the risk of disease or illness, but also just stay healthier in general. So providing active work environments, understanding how the biophilic environment affects your health and safety. And then looking at how does that really affect building standards, infrastructure and buildings, and also interior design standards, finishes and fittings, and fixtures that are good for us, locally sourced, responsibly managed, etc. And then another thing that I know is on the top of Markham's mind is how will this affect growth in the suburbs? And I know this is speculation at this point, but I am hearing from clients that they do foresee that there will be growth in the suburbs because of this. People reluctant to take TTC and or travel to high density areas, so that we are hearing, oh, maybe it's easier if I have a satellite office in Markham. It does offer parking, that is 6 stories. It doesn't take 2 hours to get up the elevator. So I personally can see this sort of resurgence to the suburbs and even beyond, and what I'm calling something the curated village. I can imagine that little towns we're going to start to see growth in little towns again, especially if continued work from home continues to be the norm. So Chris, I'm happy to, as I said before, we have all these guides I'm going to give to you guys so you can distribute to everyone, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
Great, thank you, Sam. That was a great presentation and a lot for us all to think about. I think that what we're going to do now is just take a look at some of the questions that we received. So we have some time, and there are a lot of questions. Let's start with one that relates to landlord-tenant type of issues.
Sure.
The question is, what do you expect landlords will do over the long term to reconfigure public spaces in buildings in response to the COVID pandemic?
Well, this is a good question, and it's a question that we are getting from landlords already. Landlords want to see their buildings leased. And in order for people to feel comfortable psychologically and physically in the building, I do expect there will be changes to come. One of those key changes is HVAC and infrastructure, and making sure that tenants know that that is something that they're looking at or something they're seeing in the future. The other one is, and that could be with HEPA filters or UVC disinfecting, things like that. But that's number one, making sure like the air you're breathing is healthy. The other one is making sure your common spaces are safe. So we might see some increased distancing in common spaces and lobbies and lounges and things where previously density was sort of like the norm. Antimicrobial finishes, so making sure things are easy to clean. And I love velvet sofas, but they're hard to clean. So we might see a shift with that, or maybe we'll see some of the things that we've learned from working in healthcare environments make their way into commercial office finishes. I think also, we'll have to look at the vertical transportation in buildings. So, in the future, we might see more elevator banks. We might see more dedicated elevators. We might see some lower rise buildings or buildings that are in different sort of towers. So I'm not sure on that. I mean, there's a lot of research to be done for that, but landlords are keeping this top of mind because they do want to lease their buildings. And in general, they've been quite responsive on how can we make sure that we are providing the best situation for everyone.
Thanks, Sam. And yes, Markham has been traditionally a more of a suburban environment, but recently we have built up a lot of density and have quite a few multi-story, both office buildings as well as residential buildings. So these are issues I think that are going to be have to figure it out across the board, both in densely populated urban centers as well as traditionally more suburban areas.
That's a very good point. How it's going to affect condos is a top of mind question.
Yeah,
for sure.
So next question is, what is the best practice for rotating staff in and out of the office? And if surveying employees, what are the best questions to ask them prior to their return?
Well, I think the best question to ask them is, under what situation would you return? So if everybody was required to wear masks, would you return? If we're practicing social distancing and crisp cleaning and wearing masks, would you return? So you have to really understand sort of that that litmus test for people. And excuse me, we do have a survey that we can help people with if they're interested that has a lot of detailed questions on it. But we're hearing from our own company and others that they're going to phase people in slowly, like let's say 25%, test that out for 3 months, then add another 25%, test that out. Because the hardest thing to manage at first are going to be those common spaces. And then as well, you want to make sure that we're mitigating the risk of a second wave. And so I think keeping the office to a minimum of essential workers is important at first. So we really have to depend on our HR groups to evaluate who are the essential workers, excuse me, and who really would benefit, or who will, which productivity levels would exponentially go up if they were back in the office. Because our initial surveys show that even in our own organization, which we have 53,000 people globally, we've all taken our own survey, that we're 70% as productive working from home. So if that's the case, for the short term, we should really think about continued work from home as sort of a way to mitigate that density in the office.
Right. I guess it goes back to the slide you showed earlier on in the presentation, where you showed the importance of that planning horizon of 4 to 6 weeks. So really we all need to start thinking about this right away.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't sleep. Think about it right away. You can call me, I'll help you.
Great. Stay away from that coffee pot. Since we are all different, how high of a temperature should be allowed to work? I guess that's in the office setting. How much of a buffer zone should be allowed?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I was on a phone with a global company day before yesterday, and we discussed this at length. The answer is pick a temperature and stick with it and don't vary. And I actually don't think there can be much of a buffer, because it's just too risky, just from your own, from an organizational perspective to the employer. So I think I'm sorry, I don't think in metric, but I think 98.6 is the norm. So I would say if 98.6 is the norm, anything above, you can't come in. And it's unfortunate, because I know that there are errors in those temperature readings, but I think you just have to always err on the safe side.
Right. This is another really good question, is how do we handle resistance to return to the office? Especially, this is more related to a warehouse setting where working from home is not an option.
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think it really is up to the individual. You have to make sure they understand you are implementing these risk mitigation factors, but ultimately it is still a risk. And every organization has to decide how they're going to handle that. Because if there is a risk to the employee and they are worried, then perhaps they are, unfortunately furloughed or something, or maybe switch to some sort of work from home. But I know warehouses is difficult. But these are, I think, some of the hard questions everybody's asked themselves over the past few months, which is the reason we're seeing so many businesses shut down, right? Is that we just don't know how to manage that. And I honestly don't know either.
Mm. Another really great question. Do you expect that the overhead will be much higher to run a business going forward? If larger spaces are required, must be provided for, a fewer number of employees to accommodate social distancing? And also, what precautions should companies be taking, companies like yours, for example, for those who need to take public transit to work? Are things like offering Uber, Lyft tickets, that kind of thing, being considered by companies?
That's interesting. I haven't heard the Uber Lyft tickets. That is an interesting idea. I have heard from some companies that everybody who takes public transportation will not be in the first wave of people who come back. So let's say the first 25% of people who come back are people who can drive or take Uber or whatever, which is less risky. So that stipend idea is a good idea for the transportation. I think because most companies are just trying to figure out how to keep their people employed right now. They're trying to spend as least amount of money as possible. So I haven't heard that one mentioned. I have heard mentioned, though, stipends for continued work from home, anywhere between $1,500 and $10,000 a year if an employee wants to continue to work from home to invest in their own home office. As you guys can see, I am working from my kitchen today because the Wi-Fi in my home office is very poor, and I was worried about the reception here, so I transferred to my kitchen. But a lot of us don't have home offices anymore because places have gotten so small. So that's something to think about as well. And I'm sorry, Chris, the first part of the question was?
It was really about overhead costs. So, if you've got to provide a larger space to accommodate a smaller number of people, how is that going to work? How's that going to affect your bottom line?
Oh, well, yes, increased cost for sure. And not just there, but also in cleaning. So, there's increased cost in the protocols, increased cost in the space. Now, if companies are providing a work from home program, then maybe they can get away with the same amount of space and just sort of decompressing, when they're combining it with the work from home. But overall, yes, it's going to cost us money. But as a balance, we may see some deflation in rent cost. We may see some increased vacancies. Right now we had not very much vacancy in downtown Toronto. So we may see some increased vacancy there, which might drive the cost down. So it really is sort of this Rubik's Cube. Once you turn one side, the other side turns. So that remains to be seen on how that's going to affect the economy.
Great. So I think we have time for another couple of questions. To mitigate risks, is it a good idea to have a third-party sort of audit, COVID audit or risk assessment completed for a business before they get back to work and have everybody back to the workplace?
Are you guys hearing the plumbing noise or no?
A little bit, but
okay.
I think
not so bad. Okay, I'm sorry. He's cutting a pipe. So I'm sorry.
So we're talking about third-party risk assessments for COVID.
Party.
Is that a good idea? Is it necessary?
I think a lot of organizations are stressed just trying to keep up with their daily work. So that's a good reason to go to a third party. We are offering that service, so we're of course happy to have the business. Can a third party guarantee something? No. A third party cannot guarantee a risk-free environment, or they would not be wise to do that since there is no such thing. But third parties such as ours do have a lot of global expertise that they can bring to the table. We have a lot of lessons learned from Asia and from Europe, and we're happy to share those best practices with those. And that's something I do think a third party can provide that a lot of organizations don't have when they're typically just used to looking inside their own forest,
right?
Own grove of trees and not in the big forest.
So one last question related to that, and before your dog starts barking and
starts up again.
Yeah. What are the best practices to reopening a business who deals with lots of members coming in at peak times? Because that's also a factor for many businesses.
1 second,
It may not
Chris.
be consistent. Sure.
I'm just stepping out on the deck so I can hear you. What was the question again?
All right, and this will be the last one.
No, it's okay.
Best practices for businesses who experience peak times where they may have members coming in, large groups coming in at the same time.
Well, I think we're going to continue to see the distancing we've seen, when we line up at Shoppers Drug Mart or the grocery store. We just can't have those peak times anymore or those peak crowds. We do have another seminar coming up next week, specifically on retail and businesses that operate like that. And I would encourage you all to register for that one as well. That's between Cushman and the City of Markham. So I believe our national head of retail is going to conduct that, and he'll be able to answer some of those questions much better than I can.
Okay, Sam, this is great. I just had one question that came in now, which is something that I've also been thinking about, and you may have a perspective on it. And that is, business greetings. The first thing we do when we enter a business room or a meeting room, I should say, is to shake the hands of people we're meeting with. How do you expect those kinds of customs to change moving forward?
Well, it kind of makes me sad to think about that we might not have that sort of custom that, we've known our whole lives. I have seen a few people bump elbows or fist, which is kind of odd. That's kind of like, you belong to a fraternity. Maybe we take up the Japanese way of doing things and we just bow slightly when we come into a meeting room. That's always been quite sophisticated and lovely when we're lucky enough to experience that in their culture. So maybe we have to learn something from the other cultures and start doing things like that.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. I think your presentation was really insightful and comprehensive, and we do look forward to hearing from the next presenter next week, who's John Crombie, Executive Managing Director of Retail Services at Cushman Wakefield. So that's going to be focused more on the retail side, and I think we'll have a lot of take-up judging from some of the questions that we also saw around that sector. I also wanted to remind everyone that we'll be sending a follow-up note to everyone who participated on the call. There were more than 200 people on the call today, so I appreciate you joining us today. We'll send a note with all the links in Samantha's materials, and please feel free to read those and answer or ask any questions that you might have by email, and we'll make sure that we get them to Samantha and get some answers back to you. So thank you all again. We've reached the end of our time, and appreciate all of you phoning in, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Enjoy
Thanks,
your
Samantha.
day.
And just a quick hello also to Regional Councillor Joe Lee, who joined us a little bit later on in the meeting. Thanks, Regional Councillor, for your support.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Take care.